You enjoyed your lunch, and I know I have to do my very best to keep you awake by asking unexpected questions and giving the most interesting information. By following this outline, I'll first start talking a bit about, more than a bit actually, about the construct. Everybody in the testing field, and we heard this from Barry this morning, is involved in these issues. To what extent is the construct valid? And I agree with Barry, it has one validity essentially, not so many, but construct validity is definitely one important aspect of it. And I'll spend a few minutes on that in order to introduce the subject from the field of intercultural tests in general. Then I have to make another comment to this, because I'll say some nasty things about certain academic schools in the field of psychology. And I would like you to keep in mind that I would strongly distinguish between the work of psychotherapists, psychiatrists, who several of them are friends of mine actually in Frankfurt and in Hamburg. And I very much respect the work they do when they help individuals regain or gain for the first time in their life this personal balance which makes life bearable to them. And their work is based on very, very good education, very good training, and a lot of life experience. I don't mean them when I talk about certain schools of academic psychology. I would appreciate it if you kept that in mind. I will briefly look at the discourse-based approach to intercultural competence. I'll need to have a quick look at English as a lingua franca, as the #1 language in intercultural communication after all, and the role the Common European Framework of Reference may play in this context. And only then, that may take, God willing, half an hour. And after that I will have a look at the criteria and present our experience in the field of intercultural competence testing. We've developed this test about 8 years ago in the context of projects we did for one Ministry of Education in Germany and work for Chambers of Commerce. And the test I'm referring to is actually in practice. So I'm not talking about theory alone. To cut a long story short, I'm not discussing the concept of intercultural competence in length in this context. This we actually borrow from many contributors. Intercultural competence we take as a hybrid of knowledge. While knowledge does not necessarily mean having read lots of academic books, but rather being aware that my reality construct is one among many others. And there's no reason to believe that my view of the world is the only one and the only valid one. Secondly, features of personality in terms of openness, flexibility, tolerance, which is expressed in a non-judgmental attitude in many ways, which also addresses the subject, where are our limits? We can't be limitless in terms of acceptance and openness. But the core lies here in communicative competence, which is based on a certain level of linguistic competence, and that's related to a specific context. This is how we suggest understanding intercultural communicative competence. There's no such thing as universal intercultural competence. We need to prepare for specific context. That is what is meant by this. Now let's assume you are the HR person in an international company, and your boss asked you to specify who from your staff should be sent on a 3-year assignment to Seoul or to Cairo. And then you feel a bit insecure about it, and you don't want to rely on your common sense and personal judgment, so you prefer to have these people tested. And you go to the CEFR website and you find 53 tests of intercultural competence. Which one would you take? This is one of the unexpected questions. So perhaps one strategy would be choosing the leaders of the trade. And this is the leader of the trade in global terms, actually, IDI, Intercultural Development Inventory, developed by Milton Bennett and Mitchell Hammer. They're definitely the #1 worldwide. And this is the German market leader, I see you, Ned. And I chose these two because this one has published for some time specific questions which they use in the questionnaires. These are all psychometric tests in the sense that candidates are presented with self-answer questionnaires, either in paper and pencil or on a computer. And you respond to statements or answer questions. That's the basic setting of these tests. And this is one of the questions asked. This is a test of intercultural sensitivity. It is 67 questions. One is this: unfamiliar situations make me feel uncomfortable. And then you tick on I fully disagree, or I fully agree, or can't say, or anything in between. 67 questions of that type. Here's another one. In choosing my personal aims, I prefer to be cautious rather than take risks. And again, you fully disagree, you fully agree, or anything in between. And you'll certainly feel very confirmed about this statement here, because all this is based on current psychological and cultural studies research findings. Here's one more question from IDI, the world market leader. I believe that verbal and non-verbal behavior vary across cultures and that all forms of such behavior are worthy of respect. And again, you click on fully agree or fully disagree or anything in between. And after you've answered or responded to this set of question and statements, you as an HR person will get one of these personality profiles for Herr Schmidt or Miss Miller, whoever you ask to sit this test. And now this is taken from TIS, and the blue line is Herr Müller. He is, the yellow line is Herr Müller. He is clearly above average in self-reflection, and all the others like flexibility, emotional stability, communication, ambiguity tolerance, willingness to learn, openness, and social desirability, etc., are fairly in the middle.
You may be going there anyway, but could I ask the obvious question? If I wanted the job and I was doing this, and I know how tests work, I would think, right, I could either answer honestly, or I would answer in the ways that I think, if I'd researched it well and talked to the right people, would get me the right score.
You're not the only one who asked this question, and I'll come to that. Thank you, Dave. You have other personality profiles like this one from the International Profiler, which is actually the European market leader based here in Britain. And so Miss Miller probably is below average in openness. Her flexibility is a bit spread over here. She's okay in perceptiveness. Emotional strength is very well developed, etc. So based on a profile like this, would you choose Miss Miller for an assignment in Cairo?
You would need more context.
But this is what's being done all the time. And the interesting thing are the criteria, actually, and I've read you some of them. This is the model, actually, on which these tests are based. Communicative performance is not observed, but based on a theoretical concept of personality, we choose a list of features of personality and select some of them in order to draw up a questionnaire. You ask a candidate to respond to the statements or answer the questions, and depending on the candidate's answers, you make a forecast about that person's suitability for foreign assignments. That is what's being done every day. It's all based on a theoretical concept of personality, and this is an incomplete list, by far incomplete list of criteria used in these tests. These 6 are from Milton Bennett's 6-phase acculturation phase: tolerance of ambiguity, openness, behavioral flexibility, stress resistance, emotional intelligence, emotional resilience, perceptual acuity. I'm sure you all know what that means. Focus on goals, inner purpose, reflected awareness. The fact is that not one of these criteria is supported by the minimal consensus in the academic world at all. You will not find 5 professors of psychology worldwide who would agree on the meaning of any one of these terms. So every test setter develops their own set of criteria which raises questions of construct validity, because as Barry actually mentioned this morning, there is only one validity. I agree with that. And one feature of validity which is absolutely necessary is that it's not your individual opinion about what you're doing and whether that relates to reality at all. You have to have a consensus. Be it only 20% of the academics, but not only 1 or 2. That is a construct validity of 0. And this is one of the issues connected with this kind of personality test. And very, very rarely do test setters in that field actually talk about this openly. When you address the subject, they will all admit that it's very soft ground that they are treading. They would admit this, but only if you ask them. And one exception again was Harald Meyer actually, who is a German professor of psychometrics at the University of Bayreuth, who in a phase of frustration perhaps, in one of his books, actually said, this is a confused muddle. Nobody knows what everybody is talking about. He was very open about this. And incidentally, if you're interested in these slides, why don't you write down your email and I'll send them to you, so you get all the sources I'm using here. And at the same time, it's interesting to know that many of these test setters claim construct validity. They claim they've tested the validity, and the validity is positive. But what they don't mention is that in this field, validity is established in a different way than, for example, in the field of language testing, but also material testing and any kind of testing actually. What we need in language testing is some kind of basic approach, be it functional grammar, speech act theory, or for example the Common European Framework of Reference, which we chose. Instead, what they do, they compare the findings of one of their tests to other tests who use similar terminology. So, for example, the IDI test is based on the world-mindedness, or they prove their validity by comparing their findings to the world-mindedness scale of 1957 and what's it called? The social anxiety scale from 1985. This is how construct validity is established in the field of personality testing. So if you think this looks a bit weak, you might be right. And I'll give you more evidence. This is the title page of an annual list of psychometric tests published by the University of Trier in Germany every year. This is the latest edition, published in 2014. I give a complete list of all psychometric tests of that type that are available in the German-speaking parts of Europe. How many tests would you imagine are listed here recently? That's another unexpected question. How many? Any guess?
2,500.
2,500. Any other? Any other bet? 500. Good guess. Any other guesses? 100. Well, the fact is 6,714. Dave won by far. 6,714 psychometric tests are listed in 2014 in this list. And since we have been following this for years, they grow from year to year. So in 2015, which will be published in 2 or 3 months, you'll probably find 25 more, etc., etc. And fact is, these tests are being used in the corporate field, in the public sector, in Germany, everywhere, in Europe actually, in North America. And personal careers are based on the performance of a candidate in tests like this. I assume because HR people are hesitant to rely on their common sense and their personal perception of persons' abilities, and they prefer having a document like this, objective documentation on their files. So very rarely do people involved in this field actually say what is involved, and this is another exception which happened in 2007 when a group of renowned American professors of corporate psychology and organization joined together and wrote a sweeping article saying there is no evidence whatsoever that there is any kind of relationship between a candidate's performance in the test and the same person's performance outside the test. There's no empirical evidence. If you're interested, you find this article freely accessible on the website. So just try to find it. I'll give you the source if you're interested. Having seen this, we were really, really interested. What kind of things do they do in personality theory if they provide this kind of lists of tests? And we were surprised to find that, of course, every academic field has a certain width of approaches. And all these tests are based on this approach, the trait and skills approach, which assumes that a personality is something like a part of a body. So my personality may be compared to my elbow or to my head or to my right foot. But only very few contributors in the field of personality theory would ascribe to that. The majority are absolutely on a different road. This is a highly controversial minority position. The majority of contributors look at how personality develops and how it changes and what the influences are, and they agree, and this is a list of the 6 points which most contributors to personality theory agree on. The main point is that personality is co-constructed through communication and interaction, which connects with our professional field. We co-construct personality through communication and interaction, which explains quite plausibly to me why, both in self-perception and in the perception by others, we are not one personality at all. We are multi-personalities. And it also explains why people change so quickly sometimes, depending on the situation. In some drastic situations, a personality may actually collapse, and I've seen this happen in my environment. And it also explains why people who perform very well in one of those personality tests in terms of goal orientation, they falter in a foreign environment. And there's a lot of empirical evidence about that too. So there's no relationship between the majority of contributors to personality theory on the one hand and what is being done in these tests. And so for us, looking at what was available and how, coming from the language sector, we would address the subject of testing intercultural communicative competence, it was quite clear we would not ascribe to testing personality. We don't really believe it is possible, actually. And we have ethical reservations too, but we would follow the lines of performance testing, communicative performance testing, knowing very well that language competence and intercultural competence are not the same. To give you an indication how we look at the subject, I would like you to meet Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim lives in Seoul. He's married. He's got 2 young children. His Confucian-based attitudes toward education and society and family are characteristic for him. He's in his late 40s. His parents grew up during the Japanese occupation, but his children grew up in affluent environment. He is very much a member of the Korean male community practice, which includes alcohol, among other things. He's a mechanical engineer working for a prestigious company in Seoul, and he is a member of Professional Association for Mechanical Engineers, and for 2 years he worked on a joint venture project in Frankfurt. That is an approach to Mr. Kim. Looking at the same person from a different point of view, he's a member of the Korean language community. He's also a member of the Confucian community of values. He is a member of the gender discourse because he, like me, wouldn't speak the same kind of language as his kids or my grandchildren do. So he's also sorry, I mixed that one, generational discourse and gender discourse. It's male discourse, it's not female discourse. And he is member of a professional group discourse. And he's also experienced in utilitarian discourse, which means getting things done, rather than establishing relationships. So functional language in a strict sense. That is yet another look at an individual and his or her cultural foundations, plural. And also, we shouldn't forget that each of these white boxes here are simplifications in themselves. Because the Korean language, as no language, is a homogeneous language community at all. So we have no idea what regional or social class his language associates to. And the same goes for the Confucian community of values. It's not at all so that Confucianism is the same all over Asia. And we have no idea which values from the Confucian tradition he has accepted as being important for himself or not. So although this is a simplification again, it is meant to indicate how we address the subject, how individuals and their cultures relate to one another. It's not enough looking at Mr. Kim as a Korean or an Asian. He's much more than that. And that brings us to a completely different approach. When we look at discourse communities, that is where our trade connects to. How people communicate with one another is the issue. And in this context, actually, what some people have called intercultural theory 3.0 is exactly what we accept as the basis of our approach. This is an approach to discourse which focuses less on broad constructs like culture and more on the everyday concrete actions through which culture is produced. And the everyday concrete actions are communication and interaction. Taken from this book here, actually, this quote. And that again connects us with another term which is very, very much en vogue in various parts of social organization theory and management theory, communities of practice, very much used in the research field of ELF, English as a lingua franca, which means that in international teams, it is not the culture or the language of one or two of the members of the international team, be it English. But if they want to succeed, they need to work on establishing their own cultural island. This is how Ed Schein called it. This is meant by communities of practice. And that again connects with what we have been doing and should be doing even more in the future, teaching people how to use the language in a way that we establish relationships of trust. Which brings me to this point of which English is it actually? And again, very briefly, this is taken from Wikipedia, and these are the countries where English is the native language and the national language and the language of the majority of the people. These light blue, grayish nations indicate those countries where English is one of the national languages and spoken by a minority of the people. One country not marked is worth mentioning here, China. Well, I'll come to India. Actually, some people have the wrong impression of how many Indians speak English. Estimates are 10 to 12% of the population. Just to get that point clear. Coming back to China. In China, every year, more people learn English today than there are native speakers in Britain and the United States of America taken together. Every year. And then comes India, where similar language education policies were adopted recently. So we can expect a similar development in India soon. We haven't mentioned Europe. We haven't mentioned South America, Africa. So the number of native speakers of English, whatever that might be actually, it's a very controversial issue about the native speaker, as you probably know, is a tiny minority nowadays looking at the community of English speakers worldwide. And that needs to be taken into account. And this is the field of a lot of empirical research. There are 3 computer-based corpora each of them containing about 1 million items. This one is based on European use of English, this one of Asian use predominantly, and this one academic use of ELF, English as lingua franca. So it's not a question of personal conviction or ideology at all. That's empirically based. And a lot of work in this field relates to these corpora nowadays. This is one example taken from one of the worksheets which we use for our training purposes. We don't have the time to go into this, but very briefly saying, this is taken from a research published in 2001, so a couple of years ago, when a set of business correspondence was given to a sample of Chinese business people to decide which of these was the most appropriate, effective one, and they chose one that was really wordy, lots of active face work, which we don't teach in business English, because all our course books follow this line: keep it short and simple. This is very well when we do business with Anglo-Americans, Germans, Scandinavians. But you don't have to travel far in Europe to find that this is not appropriate. And it's definitely not appropriate in large parts of the world, most parts of Asia. This was confirmed in 2010 by Andy Kirkpatrick, who again contrasted the Anglo-American style of business correspondence with what is expected even today in large parts of the world. This was only recently confirmed by a colleague of ours who has been working in Beijing for many years, who clearly said this is what they expect from you. And if you want to establish a positive relationship, you should not use KISS. It might go down very ill. So the question of course arises, what is the norm? What is it what we are teaching? And that is exactly the controversial issue again and again. And one of the answers given seems to be helpful in many ways. That's Julianne House. Based on her research, she says it's the multilingual user, the experienced multilingual user. And that raises a lot of questions. Some of them I will address in a few minutes. But the point I'm trying to make with this initial phase is teaching and testing Anglo-American English is wonderful and very good as long as we look at the Anglo-American world and part of Northern Europe. But the world is much larger than that. So we need to look at what is happening in the field of English as a lingua franca if we want to prepare learners and if we want to test learners appropriately. Last but not least, the Common European Framework, which we use as a framework of reference for our work. And you'll probably know the CEFR contains much more than 6 levels. Most of all, it contains 54 scales of descriptors for different aspects of communicative competence. 54. Some of them are given here, like addressing audiences, sustained monologue, planning, compensating, etc. 4 out of these 54 deal with accuracy. 4. All others give descriptors for other aspects of communicative competence than linguistic accuracy. That we found extremely helpful, and I'll show you why. These are examples taken from sociolinguistic appropriateness, and the descriptor for B2 says a person on B2 can sustain relationships with native speakers without unintentionally amusing or irritating them or requiring them to behave other than they would with a native speaker.
I like that. Amusing them.
And in interaction, you find a speaker at B2 can interact with a degree of fluency and spontaneity that makes regular interaction and sustained relationships with native speakers quite possible without imposing strain on either party. We find descriptors like this extremely helpful because they help us specify what we need to teach and what we need to test. But one more thing needs to be mentioned. I underlined native speakers, which is not underlined in the Common European Framework. That is a controversial issue, discussed in particular from the people in the ELF school, English as a lingua franca. They have a certain hostility towards the Common European Framework because of that. And they quote this. And they're right. But we know, because we were sort of involved in this history, the fact that the Common European Framework refers in this context to native speakers. In no other context would a native speaker serve as a model. In this context, relates to the political position of the Council of Europe. They did not want to address the subject of English as a lingua franca for political reasons. But they treated it as the language of Great Britain and Ireland. That was the background. But this is now being reconsidered, and we are involved actually at this moment at one project of revising the Common European Framework in a similar aspect of this. And I think this will be the second field where revision work needs to be done, English as a lingua franca. So the criticism is justified, but it does not outweigh the great number of advantages provided by the Common European Framework. So this was where I wanted to get at in the first half. The model, the construct model we are basing the test on, which we are suggesting, relates to the Common European Framework of Reference. We know that personality features play a role, but we are very hesitant to address that in tests. We have ethical reservations doing that. At best, we address it indirectly, and I'll show you in a few minutes how we assume to do it. We know it's important, but we would not try to educate or re-educate adult learners in terms of personality. Instead, similar to a language competence test, we would look at a list of features of communicative competence in intercultural encounters along the lines suggested by the Common European Framework, select those which are indicative enough and define a test format, and then we would ask candidates to perform and simulate in a rather artificial situation called test, and based on the performance we would dare making a forecast about that person's performance outside the test situation. That is the construct model. Which brings us to the second point on my agenda. What are the criteria? And since this is actually at the core of it all, we prepared copies, would you just pass them around, of the respective site in the test manual for you to follow actually. And as you see on this slide, we suggest looking at intercultural competence in terms of 8 criteria. 2 criteria referring to knowledge, but 6 to ability. By knowledge about institutions, process of socialization, and other specifics in one's own and one or more target countries, we mean something that has been called country specifics in German Landeskunde for the last 30 or 40 years. By knowledge of the causes and process of misunderstanding between members of different cultures, we refer to things like using English one-to-one as we would say the same thing in German. And Cornelia and I just exchanged before the session experience in that context. So contradicting in German can be extremely direct if you translate it into English one-to-one. In German it goes down absolutely all right, depending on the tone of voice and the situation. But if you translate it one-to-one into English, it's a completely different thing. It's very confrontational very often. And this is the type of knowledge we are referring to. If you're not aware of this, you run into trouble. And this is what many Germans actually experience there. And we have a lot of material about that. University students, business people, who are running into real trouble because they feel they speak English, but they use it one-to-one like German. The ability to engage with difference in a relationship of equality is as close as we get to personality. And actually the criterion, which can be measured and observed, is non-judgmental utterances. We do not claim we look into people's heads or hearts. We have no idea about what they really think, and we don't care actually. What they do and what they say is what counts. And this is what we teach them and what we test them on. And then there's the ability to engage with politeness. That is for us the key term in intercultural training and testing. And that is in particular difficult because politeness conventions vary so much. unless I'm aware that what I find as polite may be considered inappropriate or impolite, unacceptable in other social and cultural environments, unless I'm aware of that and can adjust my communication style to that, I will fail. And failing is not putting sentences together in linguistic terms, but establishing a relationship of respect and trust. And if you can't manage it like this, you will probably fail. And of course, you should be able to use oral and written conventions, looking at the target culture or the cultural island you're involved with. And then 7 and 8 is particularly interesting because never have these abilities been the subject of foreign language teaching. That's meta-language. Am I able, if things get difficult, to change the level and address communication by communicating about communication and mediating, either for myself or for others? And that needs training, because we don't want people to appear, or we don't want ourselves to appear overbearing or naive. So how do you use English in a variety of intercultural encounters where you realize that something is going wrong, and most probably intercultural misunderstanding occurring? How do you clarify it without offending anyone? So these are the 8 criteria we're suggesting to base both the training and the test on. And we've developed curricula and test material for various target groups. Actually, for one target group, that's secondary school students, in French and English, incidentally, we were awarded the European language label, because this was the first concept how we connect language teaching with intercultural competence teaching. So whatever we teach here will be tested, and vice versa. We don't test anything that's not being taught. And we have 2 basic assumptions in all this material. We need positive relationships. It's very easy to break up a relationship, but not as easy to establish a positive relationship. And in this context, the initial phase is important. If first, second, third encounters fail, chances are you'll never get along with one another. So focus on first, second, third encounters. Third point is, how are we suggesting to test it? Following our traditional line, we would test both in writing and in speaking. This part takes 60 minutes, this one 15 plus 10. Plus 10 means preparation. And the rating criteria have been very clearly developed and have been adjusted based on our experience. This is the format of the oral test. It's generally a pair test consisting of 3 parts. It starts with a dialogue about the personal background. Then the candidates get a discussion input, and as a third input they get a critical incidence. This is one task sheet as one example which we have used in the early years. This is the general discussion about my experience, your experience with other cultures, both in your own country and when traveling, what was unusual for you, etc. The second one is this picture taken from a French bank's advertisement. And then there's a critical incident, this short critical incident, and the candidates are asked to discuss potential reasons and how they would suggest dealing with them. And these are the criteria. That's just the surface of the criteria. Communication, intercultural competence, and language. 40 points all over, and language only 6. Intercultural competence means expression of non-judgmental attitude rated with 8. If that is 0, the whole test is failed. That's a killer criterion. And that's as far as we come to personality testing. And if any evidence of knowledge of intercultural theory is included, which does not mean referring to any author in the field of intercultural theory, but knowing, for example, that time concepts can be different, or knowing, for example, that proxemics can differ and create misunderstandings. What is the normal distance of communication in everyday situations, etc. Just knowing about this This we would take as evidence of knowledge of intercultural evidence. 18 points can be get for communication, and contributing to interaction is one of them, then involving other interlocutors, not having monologues, not preaching, and using the use of polite discourse convention. That is the format of the oral test. So we've had this is the written parts, consisting of 6 different parts, altogether 60 minutes. It starts with very brief, what we call in this context critical incidents. A foreign partner asks you how much you earn. You don't want to answer the question, and what do you say? What would you say? A, B, or C? That's part of the training. How do you avoid difficult questions without appearing impolite? If you don't want to answer that, what do? So why aren't you married? These questions have been asked. Even more direct questions. So how do you deal with questions like this in a situation where you want to establish a positive relationship? So this is part of the training and part of the test. The second part is listening comprehension, and we adapted this only a year ago. So the first 5 items are fairly brief utterances of mostly native speakers of English from various backgrounds, and the issue is indirectness. What does an Anglo-American speaker mean if he or she says something so indirectly that we in Germany, the people in Holland, the Hungarians, and many people in the world actually, in South Korea, just the same, wouldn't understand? What does he mean? Does he want me to do? So this is one of the issues in the first 5 items. The 5 other items are of completely different nature, and I'll play you one, provided technology works. This consists of 2 or 3 minutes excerpts from interviews we've made with non-native speakers from all over the world who address subjects of intercultural interest, usually their own experience. And this is here taken from Ardak. She's from Kazakhstan. Her native language is Russian. She's in the financial industry, is a very successful project manager, and her English has got a strong Russian accent, no doubt about that. And she talks about her experience in Ethiopia, where they speak English in Ethiopia. And see whether you can answer the question, Arda could not understand the people in Ethiopia. Is it true, false, or not mentioned?
I'm working with American consultants, so all others were American consultants. And I was working in 3 different projects, like in Ethiopia, as team leaders. In all projects I was team leader. And maybe this position or the way that I speak very basic English, very like simple English, and I'm like always like making breaks, because we do it in Russian, like we speak and then we do like, a break, then, so to say, to show the importance of what I'm saying now. And all Ethiopians told us the best English, Arabic has the best English. And I was like, no, but they are Americans, And for Ethiopians it was like, because I speak simple English, I don't speak like very fast, and when Ethiopians don't get like half of the content, then they think because they are not concerned about their own English. They are sure that they speak like good English. Then it should be something wrong with you if they don't understand you,
But not the worst English.
That's true, it's not the worst. We've got other ones from Nigeria, from other parts of the world. Some are harder to understand than she. You probably understood her, and you might be in a position to answer that question correctly. Very often we try to get at listening comprehension issues that may be sensitive. What kind of prejudice might she be uttering? Or is she uttering anything in the terms of prejudice at all? Which might lead to misunderstandings in many intercultural encounters. So this is one example of 5 items in this context with non-native speakers of English from various parts of the world. Then comes the country-specifics part, and that raises special questions because the world is bigger than one country and certainly bigger than Belgium. And we just chose as an example. This is where we combine general intercultural training with specific, country-specific intercultural training. And we ask learners in the course to define the country or the culture which they are interested in or getting ready for. And the standard procedure is prepare a presentation on interculturally interesting things. And this subtest consists of 30 questions in terms of multiple choice, a mix of hard facts and soft facts, like dress code, what kind of conventions are in terms of gift giving, gender relationship, eye contact between men and women, whom would you greet first, etc. You find a lot of information about that in the internet. You find a lot of rubbish on the internet too. At the same time, we try to prepare learners to distinguish between more or less reliable information in that field. And since there's no way of defining what you must know and what you need not necessarily know, if they answer 60% out of 30 questions correctly, which is 18 questions, they get 100% for this subtest. So the gist is you don't need to know everything. But if you know nothing, you will appear as uninterested, perhaps unintelligent person in the eyes of your visitors or your hosts. So you should know, you should be prepared. And that is the country-specific part. And the last part refers to writing, correspondence, and again, it's usually the difficult thing. We are not teaching and we're not testing the easy things, but the difficult things, like this one. You receive the following email from a business associate you have met once or twice. Dear so-and-so, this is just to let you know that I will be in your area next week and wonder if I can take you out for lunch. It would be nice to see you again. Let me know, with best wishes, Carol. So you have no time next week, so refuse the invitation. We've piloted this test with about 400 German university students. I would say 350 out of them failed in this. Things like, I must refuse your invitation. And the strategy of teaching non-native speakers of English for using internationally appropriate politeness conventions in writing can be taught and can be tested, as will be shown from the criteria. Again, it's not linguistic correctness that counts actually. In 10 points maximum, the language is appropriate for the level concerned. I forgot to mention that we got 2 linguistic levels for the test. There are no or very few mistakes and none of which affect understanding. So linguistic accuracy comes second or third. And 0 is the message is expressed in such a way as to cause offense, irritation, or confusion. Or there are so many mistakes that not even the main message can be understood, or nothing has been written. So we always look at how will this be received by the recipient. Is it helpful in establishing a relationship of trust, or the contrary? And here are examples from the piloting phase. Dear Mr. X, I was very pleased by the invitation to your New Year party, and I'm very sorry to inform, oh sorry, that refers to a different task, so, but you get the message. You are invited to a New Year party, but you can't come or don't want to come. But I'm sorry to inform you that I won't be able to attend the party due to the fact that I've already confirmed another party invitation. Yours sincerely, Johann Höllenthal. That was the student's name. How do we feel about it? Is there room to improve, room for improvement, or is that what you would teach them? So you're all happy?
It's a zero-sum decision. Shows the other one. Look at this.
Yeah, that's right. But the criteria are exactly the same.
I think it's a nice.
More booze at that party than that. The one that he's refused to.
Yeah.
It's
Like that party's better than your party, so.
It's a nice response. She probably wants to be honest, forthright, and disclose and give full information.
Yeah, Johann Höllenthal is German, and we always want to be honest and direct. Yeah. So you still feel this is perfect?
It's not perfect. It's getting the message across.
That's right.
It's acceptable.
It's acceptable. Okay.
But maybe you can suggest that it's not necessary to give the reasons, but depend on the...
For example, yes.
He wants to give a reason.
We're not giving you the lesson here. We can do this on another occasion. This is not what we would be happy with. Full. It wouldn't get 100%.
No.
Because the strategy is sandwich, soft beginning, the hard facts in the middle, and it's up to you how detailed you get, and the soft ending. There's no soft ending, for example. Let's meet next week or anything, or I'm looking forward to seeing you, etc. I'll give you a ring. Anything of this kind, establishing a relationship. That is what intercultural competence is about. And that is expressed in writing as orally. And here's another example. Ahmed said, "Dear Carol, I'd like to see you, but unfortunately I don't have any time next week. Greets." Ahmed failed. And that's the last one. "Dear Carol, I've been delighted to hearing from you. I'd love to go out with you, but I'm very busy next week, I'm afraid. We have a new boss and we have a lot of work that I'm not able to have a lunch break almost every day. Next time you're in my area, I'd be pleased if we got out for a drink or something else. Bye." Yeah, and this we would rate as perfect. This is the kind of letter, although there are mistakes, to hearing from you, etc., etc.
Yeah, but the message is there.
The message is there and the relationship remains intact. This is what it's all about. If you want to know more, what I've been telling you, you can read in this article. If you want to have it sent to you, write it on the list, because this is a journal which is not openly accessible. We've written a book, Judith and I, where this is expressed in length. This is another article on international English, and we do trainer courses. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, we still have 2 minutes. We still have time for questions. No?